Hello, everybody. My name's Mike Pierce, and welcome back to another episode of A Foggy Day on Olympus. As you remember, Olympus was where the Greek gods lived, so an Olympian judgment is from far above the squabbling of mere mortals with their partisan interests, and that's what we aspire to. But it's a foggy old world.
And my name is Coel Campo, and this is the first in our new series on early Christianity. And this episode we've called Who Were the First Christians? Who Joined the Movement and Why?
And from the very beginning, maybe the thing we need to do is to take a look at this map of the Roman Empire so we can see the extent of the empire. The areas in brown there were part of the Roman Empire up to AD 14, so when Jesus was a teenager. And the stuff in dark brown shows the acquisitions over the course of the next 100 years. But even by the first stage, with a small exception of the western part of North Africa there, the Mediterranean was already basically a Roman lake. And they were in the process of turning the Black Sea into another.
So we're really only going to be looking at early Christianity within the Roman Empire and not necessarily its spread east into Asia or south into Africa.
Regrettably, yes, that's true. And I really think we need to make an apology for that at the outset. Not because these things don't matter, they matter an awful lot. And we certainly will be dealing with them in a later series, right? The the apology is because what we're doing is the sort of standard Western oriented history of Christianity. The only excuse we can really make for ourselves, apart from the fact that it'd take us off in too many different directions at once, is that certainly in the case of Christianity heading east, the evidence that we have now has largely perished. We're relying on scant evidence because the rate of destruction of sources has been so much greater. And concerning the spread southwards out of Egypt down into Africa, into effectively what we now call Sudan and Ethiopia, uh, the sources were never that strong in the first place, but they certainly did happen. And at some stage, it's our intention to follow those through on the basis of the evidence that we've got. But yes, so we're going to look at where the sources are more plentiful, and yeah, that's the guts of what we're going to be looking at now and in this series.
Yeah, I think lots of people like to bring up it's the story of an Ethiopian, right?
The
Where is it?
Ethiopian eunuch.
Yes.
Right. I read something a few years ago which persuaded me to my own astonishment because I'm so used to hearing special pleading local stories about this kind of thing. Everybody wants to claim some biblical character as being actually from that area. And I've learned to just or relearn to do my teenage eye roll when encountering these. And this is one that persuaded me that the Ethiopian eunuch was actually from what we call Sudan. And there's a complicated little argument around that, but that's one for another time. But yes, Christianity certainly did get to Ethiopia, but a little later than you would pick up from the expression of the Ethiopian eunuch in the Book of Acts. And with that, of course, I've just enraged every Ethiopian who's tuning into this, and I'm really sorry, guys. We'll talk about this another time. You've got an important story, but that's not for now.
Going back to
Going back to
Palestine.
Palestine, right? Yes, and here is Palestine in the first century, which was slowly transitioning, if we can still use that verb, from client rulers of the Romans to direct Roman rule. So they'd come under Roman rule basically in the first century BC. Palestine was an extremely troublesome province within the empire. And what they did is, well, what a number of empires have done over the centuries is kept control by co-opting local leaders. And these are the Herods, the household of Herod the Great and others in that family. But the shift was slowly being made from that arrangement to direct Roman rule, a shift that was kind of hastened by the Jewish revolts, which persuaded the Romans that they need to keep ever firmer control and more draconian measures.
So this was really a big area of of instability in the Roman Empire.
Yes, yes, it was. And anybody, doesn't have to be a religious believer, just reading through the Gospels, you can see incipient revolt bubbling away under the surface. And of course, that was the idea of a Messiah who would rise up and free the Jews from Roman rule was what many people expected Jesus to be. And they were mad as
Right.
chips, as we say, when they found out that he wasn't. Right? There's one of the ironies in the crucifixion that the Zealot party, so called, who wanted to rise up against the Romans, wanted Jesus to be this, and they were mad that he wasn't. The Romans were worried about Jesus anyway because of all the disturbance he was creating. So these two enemies compromised with one another in agreeing to have Jesus crucified. That would preach well, but we're not going to do it today. Right, let's look at our next map here. So, Saul, who is, when he becomes a Christian, is called Paul, is a Pharisee from Tarsus. Now, this map also shows us Jerusalem, Antioch, the two of the early, most important centers of Christian growth. And then in between, we've got Phoenicia, which is what today we would call Lebanon. So it's not so much a city as a whole region.
And how important would these cities have been in the grander Roman Empire?
Well, only Antioch is really, really important. It's the third most important city in the empire after Rome, obviously, which has got 1 million people, and then Alexandria in Egypt. And then it's Antioch after that, about 2.5, 3 centuries up the road. Another city would emerge, Constantinople, which would become the second city of the empire. But the usual thing that happens, and you see it in some parts of America, you see it in Wales, the two of the biggest cities become bitter rivals of one another. And Antioch and Alexandria were rivals of one another for leverage over Rome. Nobody could rival Rome, but Antioch and Alexandria are rivals of one another. And that actually plays itself out even in the church, disgracefully. Okay, so staying with maps here, this one shows us Paul's missionary journeys, which anybody who's got a Bible will probably be familiar with because a map just like this one is probably in the back of your Bible. So it shows his first, second, and third missionary journeys, and then the last one in orange is his journey to Rome, which is where he ends up being killed, actually.
And this is happening from like 47 AD to maybe 57 AD, is that right?
The first three missionary journeys, yeah, that's 47 through to about 57, with gaps in between. Paul isn't actually he's actually converted around 32 AD, so there's like a 15-year gap between him becoming a Christian and then doing these missionary journeys. During which time he's being discipled, he's studying, he's already well educated at the point he becomes a Christian, but then he does a whole load of stuff after that. So there's a tendency because of the flow of the book of Acts to think of him as a relatively new convert when this starts. That's not the case. He'd been a Christian for about 15 years. Of course, this is right at the beginning of the church, so nobody had been a Christian for much longer than that. Um, this is the thing that kind of does our heads in. I remember when I taught this stuff in class, and we talk about like the 60s, and the students are kind of looking at you and saying, "Well, don't look any further than that. This is the first century, so don't think we're looking at the 960s or the 1060s. It's just the 60s." Yeah. Okay, well, considering that we're talking about who becomes a Christian, one of the first things we need to do is to look at the kind of ethnicities that are involved. And in the earliest stages of Christian growth, and we can see this going on in the book of Acts, at first converts are almost exclusively Jews, two main types, Aramaic speaking and Hellenized. So yeah, those are basically the two main groups in the very earliest church.
And Aramaic is the language that Jesus spoke, and most ordinary people in Palestine during that period.
Yes, but a lot of the population, particularly in some of the coastal areas, was being Hellenized. That is, becoming Greek-speaking and culturally assimilated to Greek norms, and that was starting to spread from some of those cities out into the countryside. I mean, this is not an area I'm qualified to go into, but New Testament scholars will tell you that one of the reasons that Jesus it does so much of his ministry in Galilee is that those are amongst the least Hellenized areas of the population. So that splits. You mustn't think Hellenized Greek. Okay, so a Greek from Egypt or from Greece or Asia Minor or something. Well, yeah, okay, but actually people within Palestine as well. So yeah, that's almost exclusively those with individual exceptions. And then we start to spread out from there amongst the God-fearers.
And God-fearers is a technical term for?
Yeah, what scholars mean by that is Gentiles who had seen, who were attracted to Judaism. A couple of reasons. One, they'd seen that monotheism is much more rational, as it obviously is much more rational than Greek or Roman polytheism. So there's that kind of intellectual pull, but there's also the moral pull, as we might see in some later episodes. Some of the cities in the Roman Empire, moral standards generally in society were really not very high, and Jewish standards were. And lots of people saw this as a sort of rescue from moral chaos, and certainly something worthy of respect. And so you get quite a lot of these people. Only a few become fully fledged Jews. There's a much larger number. I reach for the word penumbra, like a shadow of God-fearers around the edges of a lot of synagogues. Not so much in Palestine, but outside in places like Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt, and so on. Because the men didn't want to get circumcised. Circumcision is something that is best done as a baby or not at all, really. So this was not very attractive for a lot of them. But that meant that they were constantly considered like, not really kosher, not really part of the synagogue at all. And they considered kind of second rate. And those are the biggest audience for people like Paul once his evangelism gets going and some of the others, because what this is doing is like saying you're not second rate. The classic line from Paul is that in Christ there's neither Greek nor Jew nor male nor female. Christ has broken down the dividing wall. And so this was offering them all the things they had wanted without being treated as second rate. So yeah, that was pretty important. And one thing we need to remember, by the way, is that the Roman authorities, until at least the mid-50s, saw Christianity as one more Jewish sect. I mean, there are loads of Jewish sects. There were two types of Pharisees. There are Sadducees, there are Essenes, there's Zealots, and others. And here's one more. And the Roman attitude towards the Jews, I think we mentioned this in an earlier episode when we looked at Jewish history, their attitude was one of irritation and boredom. Irritation because these people are so difficult, they're always quarreling with one another, they all seem to detest Roman rule, and they're all completely obsessed with all these religious rules and rituals, and we really don't want to know, but we've got to manage them somehow, right? So from the casual, irritated, pre-irritated glance of your typical Roman official, the Nazarenes are just one more sect. And yes, they're proselytizing amongst Gentiles, but so are other Jews. But by the time you get to about the mid-50s, the irritated drumming fingers on table official glare of Romanitas has started to intuit that this is a whole different thing. And at that point, the Roman attitude starts to change and become hostile. We'll look at that and persecution and the reasons for it in a later episode. Well, what tends to happen with religious movements generally, including in recent times, is that the group they start out among and break away from in the early phases forms their richest source of converts, which makes the original group really mad at them. And that's exactly what happened here. So I mean, what would happen today if we started a new religious movement within, say, evangelical churches on the basis of special insights? We'll call them the Coelites, and we we start something special, and it's really cool, and it's really groovy, and very culturally relevant, and we start to our initial followers all come from whatever it is we're breaking away from, right? And the people who don't break away are going to be really, really mad at us. And this is exactly what you find going on with the synagogues and their attitude towards Paul, right? Um, Eventually, all of the people from the original group who are likely to be persuaded to become Coelites, that's all dried up now, or mostly slowed to an absolute trickle. And at that point, you need to start branching out to the wider public. And probably you'll still do pretty well, because your original insight was really groovy and hitting the right note for the moment, right? But eventually that starts to achieve a more steady pattern. Well, that's exactly what you see with early Christianity. Right? So there's a kind of a transition towards winning over more and more Gentiles who weren't God-fearers in the first place. Right? They're just simply coming over from paganism. And they're probably not a majority of Christians until the late first century, maybe even early second, something like that.
So basically, it starts out, among the Jews, and then starts gaining a wider audience beyond that.
Yes, yes. So starting out amongst Jews, and then increasingly switching over to more and more uh, God-fearers, and that happens very early on, within the first decade and a half, and then the slightly slower transition beyond that to reaching, you know, pagans, Gentiles. Yeah. Well, one thing that we really need to mention is something that's often considered to be the first church council, and it's actually recorded within the Book of Acts. We're still in the New Testament period here. We're going to get beyond that in just a moment. And it's the Council of Jerusalem around 49 AD.
So this would have been shortly after Paul's first missionary journey.
Yes, and it is tidying up some of the sort of mess. That sounds unkind, but let's say stick with mess. Some of the kind of mess that's created by it. We're told in the Book of Acts that the Nazarenes, the Christ followers, are first called Christians in Antioch, and this is where you start to get, not a few, but a large number of Gentile Christians. And the question arises, because it was the question that had been there when they were hangers on around the synagogues in the first place. Well, are they going to have to be circumcised or not? And the core leadership, of course, had been full-on Jews, and some of them thought they should be. They should, to become a Christian properly, you're going to have to become a Jew properly, and you're going to have to follow the Jewish law. And the result, recorded in Acts chapter 15, is a kind of a compromise, but it's a soft compromise. It goes more Paul's way than the Judaizers would have wanted. And F.F. Bruce, fantastic New Testament scholar, and he kind of bridges the gap, as we're doing today, between what we've got in the New Testament and what we've got in post-New Testament evidence in his book, The Spreading Flame. A wonderful book to read for people who are interested in this subject. Very, very easy to read, and like I say, blends the two perfectly. So he says the receipt of this letter, which the church leaders in Jerusalem sent, caused great satisfaction at Antioch. It should be observed, he says, that there's no suggestion that the mother church, Jerusalem, had the authority to dictate to the autonomous churches of Antioch and Asia Minor. As Hort pointed out, now Hort was a 19th century scholar, so Bruce is agreeing with him, no verb of command is used in the letter, although the Greek tongue has a plentiful supply of such words, obviously. Right, there's no thought here of a central or metropolitan authority to which the various churches must bow. Okay, quite right. Full marks, Hort and Bruce. But the question arises in my mind, why are they so anxious to point this out to us?
Does it have something to do with Catholicism at the time?
Well, yeah, or now as well, I suppose. Both in their ways are wanting to fence off the interpretation of this as saying, so you see, right back in the early church, there's a senior church that can tell the daughter churches what to do, right? And that kind of legitimizes either a Catholic or an Eastern Orthodox, hierarchy of churches and of bishops and something like that. And they want to say, no, you can't do that. They're simply, giving you their advice here. They're not giving commands, which is true, actually. Okay, so one of the things that I like to point out that we get from this whole pattern of early evangelism is two very sharply divergent models of evangelism. And one is illustrated for us perfectly in Acts chapter 2, and the other in Acts 17. Now, to summarize these very briefly for people who may not be able to remember or perhaps haven't read the Bible in the first place, Acts chapter 2 is called the Day of Pentecost. So it's when the Holy Spirit falls on the followers of Jesus after he's died and been resurrected and gone up to heaven. And a crowd comes together in the temple in Jerusalem, and Peter stands up and preaches to them. And we're told at the end of his talk that 3,000 people there and then decide to become Christians, to become Christ followers. Now, this is the model of evangelism that has transfixed modern Christians. And there's this tendency to believe amongst loads of them that this is what real evangelism looks like, right?
Yeah.
Acts 17 is a big contrast. The Areopagus was a school in Athens, and we're told, we know from other sources anyway, it was a place of philosophical disputation. Scholars went to talk about big ideas and stuff like that. And Paul's an intellectual, Christian intellectual, and he goes on and gives a talk to them, talks about the way in which they reverence a multiplicity of Greek gods. And he wants to say, well, I guess this is already good, but they've got a shrine to the unknown God. That's the one I want to tell you about. And then he talks about the biblical God, right? And what happens is, I find this story so consoling for myself, because this is how most of my sermons end. The people listening to him just laugh at him and say, "Oh, you're being ridiculous." And I empathise with that so perfectly. But we are told that although there are zero decisions made there and then, that in the backwash of this and what happens afterwards, a number of people do actually become Christians. And this is absolutely crucial, understanding this distinction. The real difference is not that Paul hadn't been having his prayer time before before going to speak to the people in Athens or something like that. And it's not
Right.
understood in overly spiritual terms. It's to be understood in terms of the difference of the audience. So, who's there on the day of Pentecost? Well, we're told quite clearly that it says there are devout Jews there from every nation under heaven. Now, usually when teaching a class about this, I would just say that sentence just like I said it, and then pause for 2 or 3 seconds and say, New Zealand, Chile, Japan, Malawi, and the students will kind of give this odd stare. And I
Yeah.
would do what I spent half my life doing, just start laughing at them and say,
Oh,
of course, that's silly. That's not what it means, is it? Right. Well, don't foist ridiculously literalist meanings on the Bible that it obviously doesn't mean, right?
right.
They're speaking metaphorically or in general terms. And you and I talk like this all the time, but we understand one another perfectly. And then I've laid another trap for them, and I say, and of course, we don't talk like that literally all the time, but you understood me perfectly, didn't you? So occasionally we do say something that literally means word for word what is said. So that's just a kind of illustration in the way that we understand one another in metaphorical ways of talking. Anyway, back to the substantive point. Once we're all done trying to foist stupid meanings, stupid, overly literalist meanings onto scripture. All right, there are devout Jews there. So they're not just Jews, they're devout Jews. So they know their stuff. They know their Old Testament. And when you look at Peter's sermon, frankly, the first 85% of it is boring. Why? Because all he's doing is he's recapitulating Old Testament history. But they all know all this stuff. They're devout Jews, right? And all he's doing is reminding them of
Right.
what they already know. And the last bit, he's showing how that all points to Christ. And actually, they already knew who Christ was because he'd been walking amongst them a few weeks before. So there's almost nothing there, maybe the last sentence or two, and even that's arguable, that they don't already know. And then he's given it one almighty rhetorical shove, and loads of them are prickling their consciences. And
I don't know that you're allowed to call Peter's sermon boring, but
yeah, I'm an extremely bad man, and I'm when I get to the pearly gates, I'm going to be in big trouble. But for so much more than just that. Oh my gosh! Right. Okay, let's turn to Acts 17. It's a completely different audience. Completely different audience. These people are pagans. They're very clever ones. Right? They know a lot of stuff. Given that is so, they probably know in the most general terms about the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, right? But it holds no religious authority for them. And scholars have nicely analysed what Paul says in that sermon and shows that he gives no direct quotations from the Old Testament whatsoever, unlike Peter on the day of Pentecost, because it didn't have any authority for them. The only stuff that he quotes is from Greek epic poets that have like a cultural and religious significance for them. It would be, here comes a poisonous Pierce remark, it'd be like someone giving a sermon today and quoting Celine Dion, right? Which have got, a cultural and a religious significance for loads of people. All right. But do you remember the point at which, because they're listening to him pretty well, but the sermon disintegrates, as mine do, at a certain point, that they start laughing at him. Do you remember what it is he mentioned?
I don't.
It's the resurrection of the dead. So they're prepared to swallow
Oh,
everything, but when he gets to that, they just say, "This guy's crazy. This guy's crazy," because the dominant schools of philosophy, whilst they're not necessarily all Neoplatonists, that's the general drift. And to summarize Neoplatonism very swiftly, which is all I'm capable of doing myself, I should hasten to say, is basically matter bad, spirit good. Uh, our bodies are nasty, smelly prisons for the soul. And so the idea that a body is going to be resurrected is just ridiculous, right? That's the thing we need rescuing from. So they're
right.
cool with everything he says about God. They're cool about the idea of Jesus being inspired by God and everything. But when he gets to the resurrection of the body, they start to laugh. So, well, uh, if we ask people listening to this now, imagine at what points in the past lots of evangelism looks like what we see on the day of Pentecost, or the smaller versions that Paul himself had done in the synagogues in Asia Minor. And he'd done the same kind of thing in the synagogues in Asia Minor. He doesn't get 3,000 decisions, but he might get 20 or 30, right? And they're there and then. They listen to what he has to say, and bam, they're in. Right? Where in the long run of Christian history do you see this kind of thing going on? And the answer is probably nothing until fairly recent centuries. Right? You can point to the Wesleys and Whitfield and Jonathan Edwards and the Great Awakenings in colonial New England and this kind of thing, and then quite a bit in Britain for a while. Not really so much in the 20th century, a little bit, but in America for most of the 20th century and some other areas. Right now, you're not really going to get that in Britain at all. Probably not most of America. But where could this kind of thing happen today? Big meeting, someone listens to preacher. At the end of the preach, loads of people say, "Right, that's it, I'm in." Where would you get that right now?
That sounds that sounds more like Latin America.
Yeah.
Maybe sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah. At a pinch, maybe Texas.
Wherever Billy Graham was from.
Right, it's drifting away from us. But loads of people think, that's a revival. I mean, it's not a revival unless it looks like that. Maybe it's not even evangelism if it looks like that. If it's not Billy Graham or whoever's alive and kicking and doing this kind of stuff in whatever period you're talking about, that's not the real thing. And this is nonsense. What do all those things have in common? What did the people in listening to Wesley or Whitfield or Jonathan Edwards have in common with the people who were in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost? They already knew all or virtually all, probably all of the information that they needed before the preacher opened his big mouth. Analyses have
Right.
been done. Who goes forward in Billy Graham rallies? Okay, Billy Graham sadly is no longer with us now, but this is still very recent stuff. Who went forward? And all the surveys showed they were people who had been in, or at least on the fringes of churches before they ever went along to the meeting. They knew and they listened, and finally a rhetorical shove came, and they were already, all their arguments had been broken down or pretty much broken down long ago. It was a psychological barrier that they faced, and wham, they were in. Whereas once you get out beyond those kind of people, it's not going to work that way. It can work like this now in Latin America. People have got this from their culturally Catholic background and so on. It's still there. It's happening in sub-Saharan Africa right now, but it wouldn't have happened 80 years ago. There were plenty of Christians in sub-Saharan Africa 80 years ago, but most people who weren't Christians didn't have any bad conscience about that fact. Right? Whereas now, if you're not a Christian in sub-Saharan Africa, if you're walking around every day with this needling thought at the back of your mind that you probably should be. And then someone, your auntie, your neighbour, somebody cajoles you along to a big rally, and there you are. Right. So as with the big Billy Graham rallies, right?
Right.
Whereas if you're living in a culture that lives by totally different presuppositions, where loads of the Christian message just seems like nonsense, laughable, it's not that people can't be converted, but that all those individual conversions are going to take a long period of time because they need to be talked through. Right? So, which is what Paul found in Athens. So he talks to them, they laugh, he goes away, he comes back, he talks to individuals, and over a period of time, some of them become Christians. And what we find in the early church is a transition where that first Acts 2 kind of, or Paul in the synagogues, that kind of evangelism is at the forefront to, as you break out beyond Jews and God-fearers to pagan pagans, not necessarily clever ones like in Athens, but nevertheless, those kinds of people, then people become Christians over a period of time. And that sets up a mechanism that was called the catechism, where people are taught what Christianity is, and they have a chance for feedback and to talk about their objections over a period of time, and then they are rehabituated. They learn what morality is and how to start living like Christians. And we know from records that typically that process took 3 years, although some documents say, but if they make progress, don't worry about the time. Just the main thing is that they get there. And what's happened, of course, in Western countries in recent years now, are living in a post-Christian or de-Christianized society where Christian ideas once again look ridiculous, is that we've reinvented the wheel, the catechism, and we call them alpha groups or something like that. So it's just a completely different model. And we fetish of the big rally out of our heads, I think, not because it's no good, it's very good, but it's just only applicable in certain kinds of situations. The difference is who's your target audience.
Right. Which is exciting news for me because I feel like I have had this argument, well, maybe not an argument, but something close to an argument with fellow Christians who maybe, in my perspective, are a little too zealous about their faith and sharing their faith. And it really starts to bother me when they consider other people who are not evangelizing the same way that they are as some kind of a lesser Christian because you're really not participating in the work that God is doing, because you're not standing up on a stage and making a lot of noise. And that has always, wow, that just really makes me angry.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, we finally we do need to evangelize, right? But it doesn't have to be
Right.
uh, prancing around the stage. And in a lot of circumstances, particularly if you're talking to a very secularized audience, you're merely going to alienate people some more. You're going to have to meet them where they're actually at and talk through what their issues are, which of course is what Paul found himself doing
Right.
in Athens. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Next big thing we need to focus on, we've considered the kind of ethnic transition, is towns. Christianity was unusual in being an urban movement. Now that can sound rather tedious to us because we unfortunately are used to the fact that practically everybody now lives in towns. But this is very recent. And until the last couple of centuries, maybe only 5% of the population lived in towns, right? But despite that fact, they were still the largest collections of people by definition. And so they were natural targets for propagating a new movement. So it's not just Paul, but other evangelists, they made for the towns. And what they tended to do was make what converts they could there, set up a church, move on to another town, and let that church evangelize their own backyard out in the little towns and villages around them. And in fact, we've got a little linguistic fossil in the English language of this process. Our word pagan comes from Latin paganus, which meant a country dweller, right? So they were the last people to be Christianized. Paganus, we get the French pays, which means country in both the English senses, like the country of the United States or the countryside, right? And a paysan, which becomes English peasant, is a country person, right? Country dweller. So yeah, pagan and peasant are related via that kind of origin. But it's a fossil of the fact that it was the towns that were evangelized first, and we see it really early on, but we see it over the next few centuries as well.
And towns would have been really important also, because they would have been central hubs of information, I'm assuming.
Yes, yes. So it's kind of like natural if something new does arise, and Christianity was very unusual. I mean, this kind of thing wasn't happening all the time. Um, But nevertheless, where there is something new starting to develop, it's going to go to the towns. Actually, that's even true today, right? You just look at where will you find the most enthusiastic adherents of, let's put this delicately, newish, fashionable ideas, and where do you find the resistance to them? Just look at the cultural divide in the US, for example. But you see maybe not quite as vicious, but still reflections of that in other countries as well, like Poland or somewhere, right? Or Russia for that matter. Right? Yeah. Okay. Well, one of the biggest ideas that I want to focus on here is how people become Christians. They became Christians on an individual basis. And this was, for pre modern people, very shocking. That is, people make individual decisions to become Christians. And that is not a standard way of behaving in the pre modern world. This is why the New Testament discusses the possibility of Christian women having unconverted husbands, Christian men having unconverted wives, and then it gives 1 Corinthians gives advice as to what such people should do in those kind of situations. There's discussion in other letters about um, Christians who are slaves and their master is not a Christian and how they should behave. And the other way around, actually. So we get masters becoming Christians without automatically including their slaves in the churches. That's what's going on in the letter to Philemon and the whole story about Philemon, who is a Christian master, and his slave Onesimus does eventually become a Christian, but that happens, I think, about 3 years later, and that's his own story. It's completely separate. Or the stipulations about who can become an elder or a leader in the church. and their children need to be believers, because if your testimony isn't credible at home, why should you be a leader, right? Well, what that means is that simply because the head of the household becomes a Christian, that doesn't include other people in the household.
But we do see a couple examples of people in their households being converted, like Lydia in Philippi, and I think also there's a jailer also in Philippi where it says, you know, as for this person in their household, they all became Christians.
Right, right. And but that's, I think, how we have to take it. Those are exceptional. They both come in the same chapter, actually, Acts chapter 16. Those are, firstly, I'd say those are exceptional. And looking at the wider context, the wider pattern of what's going on, I think we're compelled to the conclusion that everybody within those households did decide that that's what they were going to do. It wasn't an automatic inclusion. Now, what that means, and we need to say this very carefully, is that Christianity is unique and considered dangerous because it's way more individualistic than traditional pre-modern society. We want to say that carefully because the society we live in has taken that individualism to an absolutely lunatic level, right? Which is why, when Christians wade into discussions about social commentary or so help us politics, they're always sounding anti-individualistic compared to the society they live in. But that's not actually completely inconsistent. Christianity is way less individualistic than our society is, but way more individualistic than almost all, no, not almost all traditional pre-modern societies. And this was considered scandalous. I mean, the joke is that one of the things that made non-Christians so angry was that Christianity was considered to be breaking up the family. It was breaking up family solidarity, right? Which is kind of completely the opposite to the position that Christians involved in, who've been unwise enough to get involved in culture wars today have found, right? So, because in the Roman world and any pre-modern world, people making decisions for themselves, slaves making decisions independent of their masters, wives of their husbands, children of their parents, and so on. This was considered an outrage and highly dangerous. And what accounts for it, because this fits with a whole pattern of Christian behavior, what accounts for it is a particular stress amongst Christians of the Jewish idea that people are created in the image of God, and that therefore they are a repository of value in and of themselves, right, regardless of their social status. I mean, Roman society was fairly typical amongst pre-modern societies in that you got your status from wealth, position, whether you were married, who you were married to, how many kids you had. Those things pretty much decided your value. And Christians didn't act that way. So, yeah, this was considered pretty revolutionary stuff.
Would this have gone along with Jesus saying things like, if unless somebody hates their mother and father, they can't follow me, those sort of
It was
passages
certainly,
that make me kind of squirm a little bit.
yeah. I mean, you want to be careful there because he's not calling on anybody to hate their parents. It's that's clearly hyperbolic language. This is the kind of the danger of the over literalism there. But relative to the need to actually follow the kingdom of God, it will make that love look like hatred. Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, that is considered to be fragmenting social solidarity, and social solidarity is absolutely overwhelmingly important in pre-modern times. It's also extremely important now, and we neglect it because we're so lunatic individualistic. But yeah, yes, it also accounts for why, for example, the early Christians, all of them rejected abortion and exposure of unwanted infants. In fact, it was a practice in the Roman Empire if there were unwanted infants because they were disabled or they were a girl and therefore would be an expense or something else, they'd be left to die on rubbish heaps and simply died there, or some nasty person would pick them up and raise them for prostitution to make money out of them. And what Christians did was quite often to rescue such children. So, but the reason for that is because they consider that every person had real value in and of themselves because they're created in the image of God. Now, it's a Jewish doctrine, but it seems that it's even more important, even more salient for the Christians than it had been in traditional Judaism. Well, in this next map, we can see how Christianity had grown and where it had grown by around 200 AD.
So still overwhelmingly the eastern end of the Mediterranean, and the same area is mostly mentioned in the book of Acts.
Yeah. There's a little spread beyond that. You can see in Gaul, what we call France, in the Rhone Valley there, there's some penetration there, but it's not one of the dark grey areas. It's just kind of lighter grey. There is some penetration. But yes, it's that. And what we'll see even later than 200 is still concentration in those kind of areas and slowly spreading out a little more thinly in other areas. So yeah, it's Palestine, it's the area around Antioch and Tarsus, it's Western Asia Minor, Western and Central Asia Minor, what you and I would now call Turkey. It's parts of Greece, particularly up in the northeast there around Thessalonica, and little patches in central Italy. Yeah, that's and of course Egypt. Alexandria was a big centre for. Well, it's the second biggest centre, it's a city in the empire, so it also becomes a centre of Christianity very early on. Okay, well, maybe we should look at a couple of documents now that kind of illustrate the way in which this individualistic basis of conversion worked its way out. Because given if I'm a slave, or if I'm a fairly powerless, non-wealthy woman, or I'm poor, this message is going to be much more appealing to me because it's going to be conveying to me that I have agency, that I matter. Never mind if other people are looking down on me, or if I'm despised, or my life's wretched, or something like that. And all the evidence that we have coming from both hostile sources, not non-Christians criticizing Christianity and Christians defending it, illustrates this basic point, that it's disproportionately appealing to those kinds of people. Well, now, what we're going to look at here comes from a chap called Celsus. Unfortunately, we don't have his whole book, but it was quoted at some length by Origen, a church father writing in the late 2nd and early 3rd century, who wrote a book against, it's called Contra Celsum, against Celsus. So, but what we're going to be looking at is simply a passage that he quotes from this pagan Roman attacking Christianity. There, the Christians' injunctions are like this: let no one educated, no one wise, no one sensible draw near. For these abilities are thought by us to be evils. But as for anyone ignorant, anyone stupid, anyone uneducated, anyone who's a child, let him come boldly. By the fact that they themselves admit that these people are worthy of their God, they show that they want and are able to convince only the foolish, dishonourable and stupid, and only slaves, women and little children. In private homes we see wool workers, cobblers, handy workers, and the most illiterate and bucolic yokels who would not dare to say anything at all in front of their elders and more intelligent masters. But whenever they get hold of children in private and some stupid women with them, they let out some outstanding statements, as, for example, that they must not pay any attention to their father and school teachers, but must obey them. But if they like, they should leave father and their schoolmasters and go along with the women and little children who are their playfellows to the wool dresser's shop or the cobbler's or the washerwoman's shop, that they may learn perfection. And by saying this, they persuade them. Well, you can see, quite apart from the scathing tone there's this perception that Christianity is undermining solidarity with the father, the authority figures in the home and so on.
And we are sure that Origen isn't making up these quotations from Celsus to make him look bad, because even if you weren't a Christian in today's world, you'd still think that Celsus sounds horrible.
Yeah, he does sound horrible, actually. Actually, the fact that even non-Christians today reading this would think, "Oh, Celsus sounds absolutely yuck," just shows how far even aggressively anti-Christian secularists today have been affected by a kind of Christian ethos that's cascaded down the centuries, because they know from this heritage that we're supposed to value everybody, and that whilst being poor doesn't necessarily make you good, it doesn't mean you should be despised. Everybody knows in our society that if you're, I don't know, a wealthy or a powerful person, you shouldn't think like this, and you certainly shouldn't talk like it. And if you do, well, you do so indoors. But shame on you. Well, but that just shows how far this Christian attitude has saturated through, right? Whereas in Roman society, it's absolutely blatant. You openly look
Mhm.
down on people who are beneath you in terms of power or status or wealth or something like that, and in that process, you think you're lifting yourself up, right? Which is a way of thinking and a way of
Right.
interacting socially that goes completely against Christianity, obviously. But he is against Christianity, so. Ugh. So yeah, no, Oregon is not making this up. Um, that's exactly the kind of sentiment you could expect from an upper class Roman. The next excerpt is from an evangelistic book by a guy called Minucius Felix. Now, unlike most of the church fathers, whom we can date pretty precisely, and we can say where they lived, and we know a bit about their career, concerning Minucius Felix, very sadly, all we can do is shrug and say, he seems to have been a really good guy. He lived sometime in the second or third century, and we don't really know more than that. And his book, Octavius, it is fictional in this sense that he's setting up a dialogue between an imaginary Christian, Octavius, who is really a mouthpiece for himself, and an imaginary pagan, Sicilian, right? And the whole thing is designed actually basically as a kind of evangelistic book. So it's setting out the the ways in which pagans would attack Christianity, and then through the mouth of Sicilian, right, and then giving a reply through Octavius, who is the mouthpiece for Minucius Felix, giving the, or at least a, Christian answer. Okay, well, first two paragraphs are Sicilian, and the third one is Octavius, Minucius Felix, rebutting it. But our fictitious pagan is picking up on the same points as Celsus, although a bit more nicely. Um, Again, although this is fictitious, things have to reflect what genuine pagans would have said. Otherwise, the book could have zero effect. For it to have any effect on its readers and persuade them that they ought to be Christians, non Christians must recognize themselves in the kind of things that he's making his pagan say. So here's the pagan. Surely all must feel grieved and indignant and annoyed that certain people too, ignorant of learning, unlettered, and unacquainted even with the meanest arts, should pronounce definitely upon the universe and the supreme power, which after all these ages still forms the subject of the deliberations of the philosophers and their numerous schools. I love that expression, after all these ages, because here we are, we're saying this in 2024, and we're looking back on these people. We don't know the precise date of this, let's say 1800 years ago, right? Something like that. But of course, in their own times, they're the moderns looking back on the centuries, many centuries before them. And this is only natural, since human insignificance is quite incapable of investigating things divine, which, of course, in general terms at least, it is, apart from perhaps natural theology. But that's the whole Christian point, that there's been a revelation. God has revealed himself in Christ. Is it not then deplorable that an attack should be made upon the Roman gods by a gang of discredited and proscribed desperadoes? That's the Christians, because they were illegal. They've gathered together from the lowest dregs of the people a number of ignorant men and credulous women, and women are naturally unstable, and have formed a rabble of impious conspirators. They're a secret tribe that lurks in darkness and shuns the light, silent in public, chattering in corners. By the way, that you and any women listening to this can see that the Christians are going to have an appeal here, right? If this is the normal way of talking, and the Christians don't talk like this or don't think like
Yeah.
this, right, you're automatically going to be on the side of the Christians, right? Which helps to account for
Right.
why there's disproportionately large numbers of women and slaves and servants and the poor, so on, in the churches. Well, the third paragraph, I should have labelled it, I'm sorry, is Octavius, Minucius Felix's Christian mouthpiece, answering. He must not forget that all people are begotten alike, with a capacity and ability for reasoning and emotion, without preference to age, sex, or rank. Now, please, we need to do a reality check on ourselves here. This is not postmodern equal opportunities speak. This is being written, let's do the math here, at least a millennium and a half before the invention of human rights. Okay? This is coming from a place of people who believe that every individual is created in the image of God, and so is a repository of value, which is precisely why it appeals disproportionately to the people it does appeal. Nor do they obtain wisdom by chance, but it's implanted in them by nature. Hence, it's clear that talent is neither to be obtained by wealth nor acquired by study. Ooh, I don't agree with that bit. Anyway, but it's created within us with the very formation of the mind. Okay, so he's perhaps overstating the case a bit here, but you can see the general drift of that argument. Right? So the people attacking Christianity are saying the trouble with Christianity is it just picks up on these people from lower social orders. And the Christians are not saying, no, it's not. Look, we've got a senator or we've got someone highly placed. Actually, they did have a few highly placed individuals, but they were very small in number. They're saying, yeah, but that's okay because, and then Octavius tells us why. So the conclusion is irresistible. That's what was happening. Okay, well, we've already touched on the subject slightly. Let's come to this thing that's becoming, if anything, a hot button issue again, and that's the issue of slavery. Now, slavery has been practiced in the large majority of human societies, and it's the Christian's attitude towards it that's pretty revealing. So, Pius, who was a bishop in the Roman Church between around 142 and 155, might have been a slave, and he was certainly the brother of a former slave, Hermas. Hermas was the author of a little booklet called The Shepherd, which I always like to call the best-selling devotional paperback of the 2nd century. It's a very odd little book, actually, but there we are. So Hermas had been a slave. It's almost certain, therefore, that his brother was as well. You know, it's not going to happen that one brother is and the other one isn't. Later on, in the early 3rd century, Callistus, Bishop of Rome, from 217 to 222, was a former slave, possibly a shady character, but our only information is from his enemy Hippolytus. But so if you're a slave, you could be given responsibility. You're not even accepted in the church, but you could be given responsibilities. Now, I don't want to overstate this. You know, if you are a Christian wife of a pagan husband, maybe your husband's going to prevent you from participating in the church. And there's nothing the church can do about that. They've got no legal recourse. If you're a slave, a Christian slave of a pagan master who doesn't let you participate, the church can't rescue you. But what the churches do say is, if you can somehow make an arrangement to make this happen, you're very welcome with us and you're going to be included and given full responsibilities. Slave marriages had no legal status in Roman society. If you were a slave, you could have an arrangement that you considered to be marriage with a fellow slave, but your master could sell one of you without the other, and there was nothing you could do about it. But they did have status. They were recognized by Christian churches, and shockingly, by the standards of society at the time. So was marriage between free men and slave women, and free women and slave men. Now, what's coming to the surface again in one more sub-episode in our culture wars is the argument that is made about Christian attitudes towards slavery. The New Testament doesn't condemn slavery. That means it
Yeah.
was fine with the Christians.
Right. Right. Yeah. And just lots of secular people want to point that out, that the New Testament doesn't explicitly condemn slavery.
Right. The implication being that, Yahoo sucks Christianity, right? Sometimes Christians have been unwise enough simply to reply with the kind of stuff that I've just said here, sort of saying, well, yeah, but they clearly didn't like it that much, and they were trying to sidle away from it a little bit or mitigate it, blah blah blah. And I think that both the accusation and the attempted defence are completely misunderstanding how pre-modern societies work. Right? Slavery is simply a social fact. Nobody is pushing to end slavery. Right? Slaves didn't think that slavery was wrong. They didn't want to be slaves. Well, actually, maybe tiny minorities of them were okay with that because they had some privileged position or something like that. But there was no such thing as a political campaign in our sense until modern times, right? And in any case, that's not what Christianity was. Christianity wasn't set up by Jesus, and certainly wasn't practiced in the earliest centuries as a proposed means of running society as a whole. It was calling people out of the world to have their lives transformed to follow Christ, right? So it's a kind of a major misunderstanding that that's not what Christianity was, but also there are no political programs of that sort until modern times. It was simply accepted as a datum, as a given. And what we need to look at is how Christians operated within that. They're not sitting there thinking, oh, there's slavery larks all wrong, They're sitting there thinking, okay, this person's a slave. Rather like, Christians might deal with, if they're able-bodied and they're dealing with someone today who's got some serious physical handicap, or that's mental handicap, right? It's a datum, it's a given. Right now, how are you going to help them? How are you going to encourage them and love them and so on? So that's the level at which they're dealing with it. Partly because of what Christianity was, and partly because that's how the pre-modern world. Okay, well, finally, here we've got our map showing us the growth of Christianity down to 304 AD, which is the last years of the before Christianity is finally tolerated, which it will be starting in 313. So the persecution, the last and the worst, actually, persecution is still going on in 304. And you can see from the concentration of dots there, it's North Africa, both ends of North Africa, it's Palestine and Asia Minor, and it's the belt of central Italy, and then scatterings elsewhere. So yeah, we're probably out of time here, and I don't want to be long-winded here. We don't want to go over time.
Oh, yeah, like you're never long-winded.
If you're going to be like that, Mrs. Campo, all I can say is